Dr. McTavish, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into so much of your journey and kind of how you found yourself now running for governor, and just an amazing journey from what I've seen, right? And obviously we got connected and I was like, yeah, we need to have this conversation. But why don't we start with talk a little bit about your certifications and who you are today, and then we'll break down how you got there and kind of your platform now.
So I'm a Ph.D. biochemist and a patent attorney. So I got my PhD first, and then went to law school and got my patent degree and practiced patent law, and then kind of went back into the science to a significant extent. And I'm an entrepreneur. I started 2 pharmaceutical companies after getting the patent degree. So that's who I am. And now I'm running for governor of Minnesota, as you said, and written a couple of books. I wrote a book called Ending War in Our Lifetime 30 years ago. And then recently wrote a field guide to wild plants of the Twin Cities, mostly just teach myself wild plants so I could identify them better. And then wrote a book last year titled COVID Lockdown Insanity, calculating some of the benefits and harms of the lockdown strategy, and basically coming to the conclusion that the lockdown approach to COVID was just insane.
Yeah, and obviously I think we're definitely going to dive into that topic. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, first of all, you're a very well-educated man, clearly, and people who listen to my show know I'm the opposite, a very terrible student, went to three semesters of community college and was like, this is not for me. But I'm fascinated by people who are very skilled at learning, so to say. So talk a little bit about that journey. What made you get into the medical field, and then obviously the science and the patent and entrepreneurial side?
Just a digression there. I'm a good book learner, good student. I'm good at taking standardized tests and stuff, but I know that's not necessarily real knowledge, and I have respect for people who are not good at standardized tests and so on. How I got my life journey was I became a biochemist. I was actually mostly interested in plant biochemistry, and in particular in renewable energy, and the idea of harnessing the photosynthetic system to make renewable energy for humans, and got my PhD studying plant and bacterial biochemistry. I really wasn't that interested in medicine or cancer. And then I went to law school thinking I want to become a patent lawyer. I was always interested in the law as well as science, and that let me keep my hand in the science, being a patent lawyer. And then I got, right after I got out of law school, I got cancer. So then with my background in biochemistry, I got very interested in cancer all of a sudden. I had not previously been professionally interested in it. So I read a bunch of journal articles and came up with an experimental treatment, an alternative treatment that I wanted to take if I needed it. And it turned out I did need it because cancer came back. And then came up with an idea for an improvement on that treatment. And so, being a patent attorney by this time, I wrote a patent application on that idea, that invention, for a new targeted cancer drug, and then started a company around it. And thought, how hard can it be to raise money and start a company? Turns out it's kind of tough, but I was fortunate enough to raise some money, and the drug worked in clinical trials and in the lab. And then I stumbled into one large investor, and he's put quite a bit of money into the company. So started that company. It's been successful. Then came up with another idea to treat my own condition again. I was having frequent cold sores. I invented a drug or a treatment to prevent cold sores. It seemed to work on me. So then I wrote a patent application on that and started another company around that called Squarex. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years, running those 2 companies. and we've got the drugs in clinical trials. And then the lockdowns happened, and I wrote, and it threw me into depression, actually, because I lost my social life. My church was closed and my health club was closed, which was nearly all of my recreational and social life, those two things.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine running two companies like you were doing, you didn't have much social time as it was, and just having that stripped away was rough.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was rough. Also, I'm not married. I think it's probably a little easier. The lockdowns were probably a little easier if you were married or had people living in the same house with you. So anyway, it rather threw me into depression. I wouldn't say severe depression, but somewhat depressed. And I just thought from the beginning that this was nuts, and that the harms were exceeding the benefits. And so I started writing a blog about that, and calculated the amount of depression we were causing, and how, if you consider time of life lost to depression, how that compares to the time of life we might be saving in prevented COVID deaths. And I anticipated, and others anticipated, that this would lead to an increase in suicides and deaths of despair, drug overdose deaths, alcohol deaths. And it has, and calculated the estimates of how much of an increase of deaths of despair we were going to have, and how that compared to the COVID deaths we were preventing. And calculated that I think by a fairly conservative estimate that I wound up underestimating a bit, that the time of life lost from the deaths of despair we were causing would be 3 times the time of life saved from the COVID deaths we were saving, because it would actually be somewhat fewer people killed, but the people we're killing, the people who commit suicide and drug overdose deaths, are a lot younger with a lot more time of life, probably about 10 times as much time of life remaining as the people who die from COVID, which is for the most part, quite elderly people.
Yeah. Now, how much research did you do, or how much have you looked into the actual number of deaths from COVID versus deaths with COVID and everything else in between? Did you look into that when you looked into all this science?
I haven't looked at, I don't know that there's a lot of data on deaths from COVID versus deaths with COVID. I think the FDA, or the CDC rather, is certainly exaggerating the deaths from COVID, the deaths caused by COVID. A lot of the deaths caused by, or some fraction of the deaths classified as caused by COVID, were not actually caused by COVID. I think that's clear. It's not an underestimate, it's an overestimate of COVID deaths. And part of that is that they changed the definitions of, they somewhat changed the guidance of how to classify a death with COVID. So the CDC guidance on that was basically, if in doubt, say a death is caused by COVID. So if somebody dies with a positive COVID test and you think that COVID has caused their death, of course, classify that as caused by COVID.
Right.
If somebody dies with a positive COVID test and you think COVID may have caused their death, it says you should classify that as COVID probably. And that you don't necessarily need a positive COVID test either. If they've got the symptoms of COVID, you may classify it as a COVID-caused death, even if you have a negative test result. So somebody dying, so the CDC wouldn't say you should call this a COVID death, but somebody dying of cancer, for instance, or they've got terminal cancer, you thought they had 3 months to live. They had a cough, a fairly severe cough the last 4 days of their life. You can say cough is a symptom of COVID. They may have contracted COVID. They were then classified and put on the death certificate that death was caused by COVID, even if you don't have a COVID positive test. So I think it's somewhat inflated, but probably, I assume, not so much inflated in in 2020, and since then it's the number of COVID deaths and the ratio of COVID deaths to cases. The ratio of COVID deaths to cases really didn't change after we got the vaccines. So that doesn't make any sense. If the vaccines work, the ratio of deaths to cases should have gone down substantially.
Yeah.
And it really didn't until the Omicron variant came along, and then it got cut in half. So I think it was, anyway, I don't think the deaths were inflated too much in 2020. And I really, in my book, I just accept the CDC numbers and the numbers of COVID deaths we've got. But certainly it's an upper limit on how many people actually died of COVID, the number of people who are classified as having died of COVID.
Sure. And now obviously we're having this conversation now in April of 2022, when for majority of the world, it's become secondary, right? We're at least for the United States, we're kind of back to a normal life. You'll still see some people living a certain way in fear. And I feel like that is a lot of what your book's about, more than the deaths and this and that and the other thing. It's really about what mental state does it put people in, right? So these people who become depressed or who lean on drugs or alcohol, who have then taken their own lives and so on and so forth. What have you found in the studies as far as like this lockdown leading to that type of death? Like what types of numbers are we talking about?
The suicides are up a bit. They're up more, they're actually down in the elderly. They're up in young people, up more in young people, which means the amount of time of life lost from suicide is up. The deaths of despair are up like 20% or so. The CDC said in 2020 that we lost 0.4 years of life expectancy. We had excess deaths compared to 2019, resulting in 0.4 years of life expectancy loss, not due to COVID deaths, not due to COVID deaths. So I contend that all of those 0.4, those deaths that with the 0.4 years of life expectancy, most of them are deaths of despair, mostly drug overdose deaths. I contend all of that is caused by the lockdowns, that we, in essence, deliberately decided to inflict those deaths on ourselves in the hopes, or our leaders did, in the hopes that it would reduce COVID deaths. And it didn't substantially, if at all, reduce COVID deaths. So it was a bad deal, even from COVID deaths. That 0.4 years of life expectancy loss would work out to 40,000, let's see. Yeah, 40,000 people dying with 40 years of life expectancy remaining, which is about the average for a suicide. Is the average person dying of suicide is age 42 with 38 years of life expectancy remaining. So 40,000 deaths with 40 years of life expectancy remaining. It's probably, that's just in 2020. You'd expect, certainly the deaths are still going to be up in 2021 and 2022. I would expect overall we'll probably have about 2.5 times conservative. I think it's fairly conservative to guess we'll have 2.5 times overall the number of deaths caused by the lockdowns that we had just in 2020. People who become addicted to drugs and alcohol and depressed and contemplate suicide, they don't commit suicide and overdose of drugs the next day after they get stay-at-home orders. It takes some time for their life to fall apart. So we're going to have, 2.5 times that would be about 100,000 deaths with 40 years of life expectancy remaining. To get that amount of time, life of time lost, you would have to prevent 1 million COVID deaths, because the average person dying of COVID has only 4 years of life expectancy remaining.
Right.
We did not prevent 1 million. We've just now officially had barely 1 million COVID deaths overall. And as I say, I think that number is a bit inflated, but we certainly did not prevent 1 million COVID deaths. Yeah.
Now, are you seeing, obviously, like you're stating, like you wrote this book a year ago, but are you still, and I'm sure you're still paying attention. What are you seeing now as far as like how people are even operating their lives? Like what I'm noticing, and this is only my perspective, this is not a scientific study of any way, shape, or kind, but I'm still seeing people being weird in their interactions, almost like they've forgotten how to interact with individuals, being shorter, being more angry, attacking more, all these types of things. Obviously, this stemming from the lockdown, I imagine, and then obviously the great divide that was created. What type of effects are you seeing from that? Are you seeing anything now about that?
Oh, I don't have statistics on that. I haven't even updated or looked at recent statistics on depression. That is somewhat my impression, that people are a little shorter with one another than they were before. And certainly don't shake hands as much or hug as much. I mean, I'm not a big hugger. I wish I was a bigger hugger, but I'm a
Me too, by the way. I'm the same way. I wish I was a bigger hugger, and I'm just not. I feel that.
But I am a big handshaker, and I'm sure even if you're a big hugger, either way, it's just I find myself when I'm shaking hands with people or offer to shake hands or offer to hug, that I hesitate a little bit and think, oh, maybe they don't want to do this. Maybe they're uncomfortable with this. I usually go ahead and do it anyway, but so I'm sure that's out there. But yeah, that's just the whole thing. If you had designed a policy to maximize depression and unhappiness, if you were an evil dictator and thought to myself, what can I do to make the most people unhappy as possible, but I can't just do something obviously evil like kill everybody's firstborn. What would I do? I think the lockdown strategy is exactly what you would do, because we are a social species. We get most of our joy from interacting with other people. And the lockdown strategy was to eliminate face-to-face interaction with other people as much as possible, literally as much as possible. And for the interactions you could not prevent, to order people to wear masks so they can't see each other smile and they can't get their nonverbal communication. It was to destroy social interaction. It's like, if you were, it's almost as if Anthony Fauci and our leaders and so on have no familiarity with human beings. Like they viewed us as gorillas in a zoo and thought, well, we'll just lock them up in solitary confinement for a year. Like, what harm could that do to the gorillas?
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. Now, do you think that was, I can't imagine these individuals like Dr. Fauci and the others making the decisions are dumb by any means, very well-educated human beings. Do you think it was done on purpose for some reason? We don't have to speculate why, but do you think it was done on purpose?
If it was a disaster, Like I said, it caused, the lockdown strategy was a mistake, period. It's really not debatable, because it actually, in addition to the lost jobs, the lost money, the lost freedom, the huge impairment on our freedom, the huge impairment on happiness, on depression and unhappiness. So we went from 8% to 27% of the US population with moderate to severe depression. It's staggering.
Wow. Wow.
And in addition to all those harms that we basically knew were happening, we knew we were going to lose jobs, we knew we were going to lose money. It had the net effect of killing people. The entire benefit was to save lives, but it had the net effect of killing people. So it's a mistake, period. So then the question is, so they've got to be either evil or incompetent, basically. I mean, either their goal was some of these bad outcomes, or they just somehow thought it would all work out and that the bad outcomes wouldn't be as bad as they were, and they would be worth it because we were saving, you'd have had to have saved 1 million COVID lives to prevent 1 million COVID deaths to even remotely be close to being worth it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't want to speculate on the motives, I guess, but I think it is fair to say they have to have been either evil or incompetent. And so the more generous thing would be incompetent, I guess. But it's one.
Yeah, that's definitely the more generous thing. But it's interesting because now you're a doctor who has the know-how and the ability to go, okay, this is not outweighing this. You understand vaccines as you developed 2 of them. We look at all these things, right? And so now you're heading into politics, where you're the person who's going to be making these decisions for the safety of others, in a sense. So what could we have done differently?
We should have just, I like to cite the example of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In response to a crisis a lot more severe than COVID was, he went on the radio and said to Americans, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. For the last 2 years, our leaders have basically said, you people are not afraid enough. We need more fear. We need more panic.
Yeah.
So my goal would be to reassure people that this isn't the end of the world. If we had another COVID, I think what we should have done is the leaders reassured people it's not the end of the world. It's 1.7 times deadlier than the flu. You don't want to get it because it's going to be unpleasant. You're probably not going to die from it unless you're pretty elderly and pretty sick. The best thing you can do is wash your hands to reduce spread. And if you're symptomatic, if you're sick, stay home and isolate yourself from others. If you're not symptomatic, you really don't need to stay home. And there's no benefit from you staying home, and there's no benefit from you wearing a mask. If you're at risk, you're sick, you're elderly and vulnerable, you may want to wear a mask because it does do some good. And wash your hands. The main message, though, is wash your hands. Be fanatical about it and don't touch your face. I know it's hard, but that's how these things are spread. You get the virus on your hands and then you touch your mouth, nose, or eyes, which we all do all the time. It's hard not to do that. But if you can remind people that's how it's spread, so try not to touch your face unless you just washed your hands.
Yeah.
That would have been the best message, and just kind of a reassurance that this isn't smallpox. It's not the end of the world. Go about your lives.
Do you think if we went about our lives, this is an interesting question. Do you think if we went about our lives as we normally did and took the precautions, right? Hey, there's a sickness out here, be aware. Do you think we would be exactly where we are now?
Yes, I don't think the lockdowns made any difference at all in number of COVID deaths. We would be exactly where we are on COVID deaths, but we wouldn't have had we wouldn't have thrown 63 million people into depression, and we wouldn't have thrown 16% of the workforce out of their jobs. We wouldn't have destroyed all these small businesses, and we'd all basically be happier and freer.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is I think there needs to be a larger narrative on being healthy. Staying active and losing some weight. I think the number was 85% of COVID hospitalizations were people that were obese or morbidly obese, right? To not bring that up in a sense and say, hey, maybe we should get some fitness back into this country. I mean, that would have made a huge difference, I'm sure.
I'm sure. I have a friend who works at the hospital, and she told me that in this wave like this August, I guess, the secondary waves of COVID, they had a younger population in the hospital than they had previously from COVID, but they were nearly every one of them was morbidly obese. And that, for whatever reason, that came out a little bit in the press occasionally, that obesity was a risk factor, but it was probably understated to the extent it was a risk factor, which is probably somewhat trying to be compassionate to people and not blame the victims for being overweight and obese, which is fair, and we should not. But at the same time, that's just kind of the reality.
Yeah, for sure. So what made you want to jump into politics?
It was mostly the lockdown, I first started thinking about running for governor with the lockdowns. I thought this was just so insane. I keep coming, I say a couple of times in my book that I felt like the kid in the emperor with no clothes story, that I'm standing on the sidelines and everybody's saying, oh, this makes such sense, and the emperor's got such a beautiful suit of clothes, and I'm sitting there saying, huh? He's buck naked. This makes no sense at all. The whole thing's insane.
Yeah.
So that's what made me want to get into it. I had the core issue of my campaign is something called jury democracy, which is actually an idea I had 30 years ago. And that's really why I decided to run. Otherwise, I probably would not have. But jury democracy is the idea of using large juries, a statistically valid sample of the population, just randomly selected registered voters, to make decisions for the government. So, and ideally to be a new House of the Legislature. So every bill, when I'm pledging as governor, every bill that passes the legislature will call a jury of about 1,000 people to St. Paul, our state capital, have them sit through the arguments and the evidence for and against that bill, just like juries sit through the arguments and evidence in a civil or criminal trial. And then break into groups of 12. We'll read the bill in full, give them time to actually read the entire bill. And then break into groups of 12 and discuss it and amongst themselves and try to sway your other jurors. And then take a secret ballot vote of the whole pool of 1,000 or so. And majority wins. So in effect, it would be a third House of the Legislature. I would not sign the bill unless it was passed by the jury. And if they tell me to veto it, I'll veto it.
Fascinating.
And I would like to amend the state constitution and ultimately amend the US Constitution to add that as a House of the Legislature, replace one of the two houses of Congress or one of the two houses of the state legislature, or if we can't get them to give their jobs up, add it as a third House of the Legislature, that every bill has to get through to become law. And we can do the same thing for regulatory decisions. One of the issues here is whether to allow a copper nickel mine near the Boundary Waters Wilderness in northern Minnesota, and another mine near Lake Superior, which would probably leach toxic metals into Lake Superior into this wilderness area. So I strongly oppose that. But that's a regulatory decision. It's still on the table with our current governor and our current administration. I'd call the jury and say, here are the arguments for and against the mine. I'm confident they would reject the permit for that mine. So decisions, not just legislature, but regulatory decisions. And ultimately, I'd like to, I think we can have a jury replace the Supreme Court also, the US Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court.
Wow.
And have a jury make those final decisions.
It's such a fascinating idea, right? It's almost like going back to, in a way, the only way you could go back to how it was, even back in 1776, where it was power to the people, right? It was the people's decision on where we were going and the decisions that affected our lives. Because right now it's left up to, big government and them making the decisions that suit them in their own right. Now, when you're thinking this, is this fully bipartisan? Is it all parties? How would you look at those 1,000 people?
Oh, the 1,000 people would just be randomly chosen. So it would be, most of us aren't, well, a lot of us are partisans one way or another, and a lot of us are not really very partisan. A lot of us are not political, really. And hopefully even the non-political ones show up for jury duty. But I would make it voluntary, so you don't have to show up if you don't want. And ideally also not let people know what bill or proposal they're going to be considering. So we get a truly random sample, whereas if they know it's a bill on abortion, we'll have the people who feel strongly about that showing up, which isn't necessarily a random sample of the population or whatever the issue is. And if they know it's patent law, they'll say, well, that sounds pretty boring, I'm not going to show up. Purely random. So it's perfectly proportional representation. Blacks, women, poor people, ethnic minorities of all types, everybody is represented proportional to their numbers. Poor people would have real power. They'd actually, which they have no power at all in our current system. And the 1%, the top 1% of the income ladder, who basically have all the power, they would have 1% of the power.
And I think people can get behind this idea right now because of everything that's going on, right? We saw the ultimate power of big government. By the way, I'm not on one side or the other as we talk about this. Like I don't live on one end or the other end of the spectrum when it comes to politics, and I haven't really for a really long time. But when you see the power of big government, whether it be lockdowns or anything else that we see now coming down the pipeline, it's very, very interesting. I think this is an intriguing way to look at things. Like I wish I lived in Minnesota. I'd give you a vote. That's that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's, I think the response to COVID shows poor decision-making by elites and experts. I don't believe that experts make any better decisions than non-experts. certainly not on areas outside their expertise, and apparently not even on, COVID. They didn't make good decisions even on their areas of expertise. Although you could say they were making decisions on their very, very narrow base of expertise, like they were viewing their task as reducing COVID deaths, period. And they just didn't consider or didn't care whether that increased cancer deaths, whether that increased suicides and depression, what economic effects it had. They just didn't weigh that because that wasn't in their area or purview, maybe. But so the ordinary people are going to weigh everything and how it principally how it affects their own personal well-being, but also their own, even more so really, I think their own moral sense and common sense of how they think it's going to affect everybody in general, and their children and grandchildren and their neighbors. Anyway, people, I think COVID proved, kind of like Vietnam proved, the best and the brightest do not make the best decisions. Ordinary people make at least as good decisions as experts.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. Obviously, look, you're a busy man, and I want to respect your time, but being part of, being a busy man, you're running 2 companies, you're not running for governor. I mean, how much more can you've written 3 books. We could keep putting stuff on your plate. So I'm curious, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask every single person on the show. It's a 2-part question. First part is, what is your definition of success? And the second part of that question is, what are 3 things you do every single day to ensure that success for yourself?
I think I guess I don't have a predefined, I didn't think about it beforehand, but I would say my definition of success is success in achieving whatever your goal in life is, which is really happiness and meaning. I think for nearly all of us is ultimately the goal. So that's probably my definition of success. And 3 things I do every day. I do a qigong routine in the morning. I think that's important to keep my body and my mind healthy. I try to do some meditation or prayer in the morning. I'm not necessarily great about it. I do have to-do lists. I think I can get better about, I think scheduling things would actually probably be better than checking them off my to-do list and saying, I anticipate that this task is going to take a half hour, so let's do it at 10 o'clock to 10:30. Yeah. Anyway, those are 3 things I try to do.
No, I love it. I wrap up every single interview with the same question, but before we get there, I did a little research before you came on with my listeners, and I found out that for some odd reason, Minnesota, out of all the states in the United States, is ranked number 10 out of how many listeners I have per state, which is so weird. I've never been to Minnesota. I don't, and I travel a lot to speak and stuff, and Minnesota has never been on the docket for me, but it was interesting to see that it was doing well. So anybody listening in Minnesota, if you liked what he had to say, if you see this man's vision, where can they go to learn more about what your platform is speaking on, and so on and so forth?
My campaign website is McTavish4mn.org. McTavish is McTavish. And so, yeah, not just Minnesotans, but I'd encourage everybody to go there, read a little bit about jury democracy. And if you're excited about jury democracy and excited about my campaign, I'd encourage you to come and donate and sign up for our website, whether you're living in Minnesota or not. You do need to be an American to donate to the campaign, not a foreigner, but you don't have to live in Minnesota. But yeah, we need to raise money. That's the milkblood of politics. We do need to raise money, so I hope people can participate in that.
Yeah, for sure. Now, like I said, I wrap up every single interview with the same question. Since the show is called The Growth Now Movement, that question is, in your life, what has been your biggest moment of growth?
I don't know. There was a single moment. Maybe the most dramatic thing that comes to mind is my getting cancer and then inventing the cancer drug, which isn't a single moment exactly. Yeah. Well, actually, when I wrote my first book, Ending War in Our Lifetime, there was kind of a single moment. I really felt like one night, basically God was talking to me and telling me, write this book. You need to write this book.
I have to check that book out. It's a fascinating title. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with my audience, but also, and at times, which was an uncomfortable time to speak up and voice your opinion in the way that you did. Thank you so much for doing that as well, because I think it's important to give back a voice to others by being a voice. And that's really what I see you doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for saying that.